This video is going to be kind of an intro to energy use in cells and metabolism. So energy. Recall that energy is the ability to do work. So the ability to do anything in the cell requires energy. So in order for something to remain living, there needs to be a consistent input of energy. And the AP curriculum likes to refer to free energy. So that just means energy that's sort of available to be used. In order for the organism to remain living, the energy input must exceed or equal the energy output. So as energy gets used or lost, so living organisms produce heat as they perform their internal chemical reactions. So that's a way that energy gets used or lost. And also by things like moving around or sending signals in their nerves or their brain or building new tissues. Really anything that the organism cells are doing, almost all of it requires energy. And so as they're using that energy, they need to take new energy in order to be able to continue to do those processes. If you're an animal, the way an organism would take in that energy is through eating food. And if you are a plant, the way the organism would take in that energy is through, of course, the sun or light. So, a couple questions to consider. What do you think will happen to an organism that takes in more free energy than it uses? Or what if an organism takes in less free energy than it uses? So take a minute, consider that. So if an organism takes in more free energy than it uses, if it is a growing organism, like a child or a baby, whatever, then that energy can be used for growth, to grow taller, etc. If it's not a baby organism, or if it is a baby organism but it's taking in even more energy than it needs for growth, that energy will be stored. And the way that humans store extra free energy is by putting it into the bonds of fats. So basically that individual would gain weight. On the other side, if it doesn't take in enough free energy, it will lose mass and eventually die if it can't get enough free energy. So this dog was rescued from a hoarding situation, I believe, and the dog was fine. They fed it up, but just looking at what happens if something doesn't take in enough free energy. It's just another way of saying not getting enough food, or if it's a plant, not getting enough sun. Since we're talking about energy, of course, we need to talk about ATP. So remember that ATP is the molecule that your cells directly use for energy. You can't just, put a hamburger into your cell and then your cell can do a cell process. The energy from that hamburger needs to be converted into the energy in ATP. Now, the hamburger itself, its molecules don't go into making the ATP, but the energy in the bonds of its molecules go into the energy in the bonds of the ATP. So it's important to remember the difference between energy and atoms or matter. The energy is transferred, the atoms and matter are not transferred into the ATP. And now if we look at ATP, this is adenosine triphosphate with 3 phosphates. When it gets quote-unquote used, it is converted to adenosine diphosphate, or ADP. ADP is kind of like a dead battery, and ATP is like a charged battery. And the way that this gets recharged into that is using energy from the food through the process of cellular respiration, which we'll talk about later. So the way organisms use energy is they couple processes that use free energy. We could also say that they have a negative value for free energy, and those are things like building molecules, making ATP by attaching the phosphate to it, moving. sending nerve signals, active transport in the cells. All of those things that use energy or ATP have to be coupled with a process that releases energy. And usually that process that releases energy is the breaking down of ATP into ADP, removing one of those phosphates and then releasing the energy that was in that bond in order to do this process that uses the free energy. So now let's look at the concept of metabolism. I'm sure you've heard this word before. Someone might say that they have like a high metabolism or a low metabolism. So what does that really mean, metabolism? And then the second question I want you to consider is, if we compare this elephant to this mouse, obviously the elephant is much larger than the mouse, right? So pound for pound, which of these should have a higher metabolism? The mouse or the elephant? Think about that. Answers to those questions. What is metabolism? Metabolism is just a way of saying all of the chemical reactions inside of an organism that are using or converting energy, which is most of the chemical reactions inside an organism. We particularly, though, are referring to the ones that are involved in breaking down food into energy, so like the cellular respiration stuff. And in general, a smaller organism will have a higher metabolic rate than a larger organism. And a lot of this comes down to that whole surface area to volume problem. These are both animals that need to maintain their body temperature, and for the elephant, it's got a much larger volume relative to its surface area, so heat doesn't escape from the elephant at the same rate as it does this little mouse, which has a higher surface area relative to its volume. So the mouse loses heat very quickly, while the elephant's core, it would take a long time for that to actually cool down to the point where it was dangerous for the elephant. So this mouse must maintain a much higher metabolic rate to produce the heat that it needs to keep itself warm, whereas the elephant can have a lower metabolic rate because of that surface area to volume ratio. So this isn't necessarily true for every single organism, but in general, a smaller organism has a higher metabolism than a larger organism. They tend to have to eat more often, and they usually tend to live shorter lives than the larger organisms with the lower metabolic rates. There's two basic energy strategies that different animals employ. One of them is called endothermy. Endo means like inside, endo, like enter, it was like the endocytosis. And so endotherm is commonly called, casually, being warm-blooded. So these include organisms like mammals, such as these puppies, the larger birds. These animals maintain a consistent internal body temperature, and they do that using their metabolism. So they need to use a lot of energy in order to maintain that temperature and make sure that they stay warm enough. So a lot of the energy from the food that endothermic organisms eat goes into maintaining their body temperature. And of course, humans are included in that group of endothermic organisms. The advantage of this is that they can maintain a very stable body temperature, and so that makes them more efficient at carrying out their chemical reactions regardless of the external temperature, so that they can remain active in a larger variety of external temperatures. The other energy strategy that some organisms have is called ectothermy. So ecto refers to like outside. These organisms are more casually called cold-blooded, and what that means is not necessarily that their blood is literally cold, but that their body temperature matches their external environment. So if this fish is in, 30-degree water, then that fish's body temperature is 30 degrees. These organisms include things like insects, fish, reptiles, amphibians. The advantage to this is they don't have to use as much energy to keep themselves warm. So the energy from the food they eat can all go towards other body processes. They don't have to eat as much because, again, a tremendous amount of energy for endotherms is expended keeping them warm, and that means that they generally need to eat more often and eat more. The disadvantage to this strategy is that if it gets colder in their environment, they just kind of slow down and shut down and get sleepy because they just don't have enough energy left anymore to keep their body's chemical reactions going. Right, so a couple questions to consider. In general, again, like pound for pound or gram for gram, I guess, if we're using metric, which would you expect to have a higher rate of metabolism? An endotherm like a puppy or an ectotherm like an iguana? And second, would you expect an endotherm to have a higher rate of metabolism in a warm environment or a cold environment? And then what about the ectotherm? So you might want to pause, take a minute to think about that. So the answer's here, and I've kind of been talking about it already, but generally we would expect an endotherm to have a higher rate of metabolism because they need to use more energy in order to maintain their temperature and keep themselves warm. Now, if we were in a very warm environment, that endotherm doesn't have to use as much energy to keep itself warm anymore, right? Because the external environment is already pretty warm. So we would generally expect them to have the higher rate of metabolism in the cold environment, because the colder it is, the more energy that endotherm has to use to maintain their body temperature. Now for the ectotherm, the opposite is kind of true. If the ectotherm is in a warm environment, then everything's sort of running smoothly for them. They've got their body temperature up where it needs to be, and they can do all their chemical reactions and digest. If an ectotherm is in a colder environment, their metabolism goes down because their enzymes can no longer function at their peak level because their body temperature goes down as well. So we see sort of the opposite pattern about environmental temperature with endotherms and ectotherms and their metabolism. Now we're going to just start talking about the process by which animals can take energy stored in their food and convert it into energy stored in ATP. And so that process is called cellular respiration. So see what you can remember about cellular respiration. There's like an equation for it, right? There's two things that the animal takes in, and then there's two things that come out. So what are those things? So the answer is the two things that go in are oxygen. This should make sense because animals need to breathe in oxygen. Animals just like you, that's one of the things that we need to take in order to function. And the other is glucose. So glucose is sugar. That's just, comes from your food. Now, you might not eat a diet solely of glucose and sugar, but anything you eat that's a carbohydrate can be broken down into sugar. So anything that's like a grain or a starch or obviously a sugar breaks down into a sugar. Things that you eat that are like proteins and lipids, those sort of get broken down into smaller molecules separately, and some of those enter the cellular respiration process at a different point. But when we're talking about cellular respiration, we're usually looking at kind of the simplest example of it, and that is using the glucose. And that's where, again, a lot of the energy is coming from glucose because that's all the sugars and carbohydrates and grains, etc., that you might eat. The things that are produced by cellular respiration are carbon dioxide gas, so that should make sense, you breathe that out, and also water is produced through cellular respiration, H2O. The ATP is produced through cellular respiration, although it's not these atoms that are making the ATP, but it's the energy in these bonds in this glucose that is being pulled out and used as energy to put this together. So here is our chemical equation. I wonder if any of you remembered it. 6O2 plus C6H12O6, which is the glucose, yields 6 CO2, carbon dioxides, 6 waters, and about 38 ATPs with the energy from that. 38 ATPs is kind of a best case scenario. Usually it's actually less than that. What happens is it can get adjusted so that more of the energy goes into the ATPs or more of the energy goes into heat, depending on how much heat that organism needs to generate. But here's our general equation, and you should see that all of the atoms are accounted for, right? I have 6 carbons here. I end up with 6 carbons over here. 6 oxygens, and then another 12 oxygens, so 18 oxygens. Here's 6 oxygens, and then another 12 oxygens. Sorry, that's getting messy. And then 12 hydrogens, 12 hydrogens. Every atom is accounted for. So we can see that the atoms in the glucose and oxygen did not become the atoms in the ATP. These atoms just got rearranged into this stuff, but the energy that was in here has been removed and used to make the ATP. So next video, we'll get more into the actual process, how this is done. It's kind of a complicated, long step-by-step sort of thing, so this is enough for today, but next time we'll get more into it.